All right, listeners, it's Ryan and Megan, and welcome to the Mental Health Mixtape, a podcast dedicated to fostering open conversations, sharing stories, and exploring a diverse range of topics related to mental health. So hold on to your seats as we sit down with some amazing guests to get their perspectives on the ever-changing landscape of mental health. And for all you old folks, no need to hit the record and pause button. Just sit back and let us navigate life's playlist together. During this podcast, you may hear stories about traumatic events and our guests' experiences. There may be discussions about suicide, traumatic events, and the outcomes from these events on personal lives. If you're struggling with anything you hear, please reach out to your peer support team, psychologist, call 911, or head to the nearest hospital. In Canada, you could call Boots on the Ground peer support for first responders at 1-833-677-2668. Talk Suicide Canada at 1-833-456-4566. And in the United States, call 988 for the National Crisis and Suicide Lifeline. It should be noted that the information shared on this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional medical, psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Welcome, Jodie. It's great to have you. I know you've been messaging with Megan back and forth, and we've exchanged a few emails, but I mean, for those people that are just tuning into the podcast or who don't know you, you have quite an interesting story, and I want to get into it, but I think what would be nice is if you just introduced the listeners and the viewers to who you are and how you came to be sitting on the podcast, and then Megan can ask you the one question we just love to ask.
All right, I'm happy to be here. Who am I? I'm Jodie Baulkham. I'm a licensed teacher, educator, former RCMP employee, current RCMP spouse, life coach. I grew up in Ontario, found my way up to the Northwest Territories after falling in love with a want to be RCMP officer. And so moved to Yellowknife Northwest Territories when I was 23, had a wonderful time up there. My daughter was born up there. Loved that experience, even when Chris was killed in the line of duty in Hay River. That brought me to Ontario, into Ottawa. That was Chris's hometown. And so I brought Alexis down. She was about 14 months at the time we moved. I wanted to have greater support. I grew up on a farm in southwestern Ontario, and while I loved my childhood, I couldn't see myself at that stage of life at 29 going back there. And so had a lot of support from Chris's parents, and through the support that the RCMP gave me, they offered me an opportunity to work in a committee that helped to create resources for RCMP families, not just like mine, but others, with first responder communities and being transient and shifting across the country. There's considerations around that. And so I volunteered my time in that space, and then I used my education degree inside of the organization when I had the opportunity to help develop their leadership and management curriculum. And so that's what I did for 16 years. And, glutton for punishment, I suppose I fall in love with another RCMP officer, but I said, this time you need to have a desk job. And Brent did. He actually was transferred from Alberta to Ottawa to help spearhead a peer-to-peer program that the RCMP was creating at the time. He was leading that project. He was ready to pilot in a couple of divisions, and then the funding was cut. And so it was very shortly after that Brent started to exhibit serious signs of declining mental health. And so he medically retired in May of 2015 with post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive disorder. And then that little baby, who's now 17 and a half, and she got accepted to university. And so I kind of have the moment of my baby is growing up and being an adult. When she was 9 years old, she came to me and said, "Mama, I can't control my equals." And that was her way of letting us know that she was living with obsessive compulsive disorder. So, having gone through my own journey and then living with folks who have experiencing, mental health challenges, it's been my everyday for a very long time. Inside of the RCMP as well, I had the opportunity to serve as a mental health champion, so was able to have those conversations at the senior leadership's table on what are we doing in order to best support our employees' well-being. And so really enjoyed that work. And then about 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so fortunately for me, I didn't require chemotherapy or radiation, but I did undergo 4 surgeries in 2.5 months that culminated with a double mastectomy. And so I had a lot of time where I was in bed thinking and recovering, not able to access the usual things that I do for self-care. And so I turned to journaling. And so it was through that process of journaling that I was like, wow, I, one, have a lot to say, but 2, I think I have a really important story to share with people that could offer some hope. And so I wrote a book. It's called Choosing My Tomorrow: Surviving Murder, Navigating Mental Health, and Harnessing Your Power of Choice. And so that was published and released in January of 2024. And I've stepped out of the organization officially in mid-August, and I'm now kind of teaching in the mental health space, promoting conversations about well-being, and just helping folks who are going through hard things. So that's a relatively long answer to your simple question.
No, and that's typically how it goes, Jodie, because I don't know, we're just so fortunate that the people who want to come on the podcast just have these incredible stories like yours. And the question we ask people is like, what in your journey or what's happened to kind of bring you to this place that you're sitting with us? And I think you already sort of beautifully answered that. Mm-hmm. There's so many directions this conversation could go.
You're either Jodie, making notes, Megan, or there's so many places as well. I'm just amazed.
Ryan, I think you know that Jodie and I had the opportunity to meet one another. When was that, Jodie? In March or April, something like that?
April at the First Responder Gala. Yes.
Yeah. So we just, happenstance ended up being sat next to one another at this booth that we were at, and yeah, Jodie, your story is just, it's so compelling. And I think it's really compelling for us. Like, Ryan, I'm going to speak for you for a second.
Yeah.
Just because this is what we hope to do with this podcast is it's not just about talking about the problem of mental health. It's like finding people who have done really inspirational things with their experience, right? And, like listen to what you just shared with us, like losing your husband in the line of duty, moving all over this country, your husband now having mental health problems, retiring early, being in an outfit that has so much exposure to trauma and stress of different kinds, breast cancer, it's just like you have so many things, and one could reasonably understand if you were like, forget it, world, you beat me. But that's not what you've done with it, and I just find that so compelling.
Yeah, thank you. There were moments I threw my hands up and had some choice words, but I've learned very quickly not to ruminate on the why. And this is something that I often share with my clients. It's stopping the why is this happening to me? And you're likely never going to find an answer that satisfies you. And that's going to keep you in the past. And so instead, Dr. Tasha Eurich talks about asking the question, what? So what now? What next? If you're feeling well supported, what can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? So I think being a new mom and Alexis being so young to not change any of her behaviors based on the circumstances that I found myself in. She still cried when she was hungry. She still needed to have her diaper changed. She still needed all of these things that I didn't have a chance to just check out. And so it was always, okay, like, what can I do now? What can I do next? And I threw myself into reducing any kind of trauma that was going to transfer from me to her, because even though she was little, she's not processing things the same way, but she does feel things. And so it was my goal to be like, okay, how can I mitigate that as much as possible? And that was really focusing on the what's. And even when she came to me with her OCD diagnosis, that was right after Brent had a significant episode, like to the point where they thought that he was having a stroke, and they did all of the tests, but in medical terms, everything came back unremarkable, which was the evidence that he needed to say, okay, this is the result of stress. This is the evidence you need to start your journey to recovery. And so, yeah, when he was going through his early recovery, and then Alexis said OCD, that's when I threw my hands up. I was like, really? Like, what else right now? But there again, it's like, what next? Okay, so Alexis gets into therapy. I get into more concentrated therapy. And then all of those tools came forward. And you know what? As a 17-year-old and navigating life as a teenager in high school, those tools that she learned when she was 9, 10, and 11 have really come back to allow her to experience and view the world differently with coping strategies that some of her friends are still learning. So yeah, that's actually been very interesting to see over the course of her teenage years.
I love that perspective of why versus what's next. I absolutely love that. And I think for me, learning that, or at least taking the opportunity to understand that to a deeper level, it takes time. So I guess, that leads into the question of, was there moments where it was just, why me? Or how long? I know you articulated with Alexis being so young, you didn't have much of a choice. You needed to get to the things that just life offers you, but there had to be moments that the what's overshadowed the what's next, or the why is overshadowed the what's next.
Yeah, I think honestly that was probably months 3 and 4 after losing Chris. And so, it happened up in the Northwest Territories. Our home is Ontario. There was a 6-day manhunt. I'm trying to keep up and learn, fill in the blanks with questions until the shooter was apprehended. We fly to Ontario. We do the huge regimental funeral in Ottawa. There were like 2,500 officers who marched from Parliament Hill to the Basilica where the service was. And so it was a lot of public. I was in the public quite a lot. There was a lot of pomp and ceremony around that. You know what? I would have loved to have just done things privately, but I did make the choice to try to honor Chris in the way that I felt he would want to be honored, not necessarily what was my first choice. And he was so proud to be a member of the force. And so I thought the regimental funeral would meet that need. And so then it was like I was slowly making my way back up north. And then, that was 3 weeks later. I had a lot of people. At the beginning, a lot of people come and they surround you. And so they kind of put you in a little bit of a bubble, forcing you to eat, forcing you to sleep. And so it kind of wasn't until I went back to Ontario again for Christmas with my folks. And then I returned in January. And that was the first time that Alexis and I really had any opportunity to be by ourselves, to figure out what life, just the two of us, was going to look like. And so I did at that point. And I will also offer, Chris was killed in October on Thanksgiving weekend. And then another young Mountie was killed within 30 days in Nunavut. And so I spoke out publicly at that time about backup policy and not doing enough to keep the members safe in northern communities. And so, there was it was piling. And so, we have Chris's death, we have Doug Scott that died, we've got our first holiday, baby's first Christmas without things, and then I come back and I'm by myself. And so I needed that in order to realize how my life had changed. And so, yeah, during that time, I would say there was some of this, it is hard. I don't know if I can. What does it look like? Why did this happen? But there again, not for very long, but it was there.
I mean, one of the things that I think about, and Ryan and I talk about together and then on this podcast, is like, so for all the things that I've understood through the science and research and then also in clinical practice, like, I think we can become quite categorical in, I'm not sort of overcoming or moving through something until I feel okay about it. And I would argue that I actually think the two things can exist at the same time. Like, we don't have to be okay with something or feel good about it or even feel like we're moving forward necessarily to be growing from it, right? So I guess my question, Jodie, is like, I would imagine that if people are listening to this and listening to your story and maybe they're struggling, like, almost hearing you and what you were able to do is almost kind of miraculous, like, how do you overcome, or how did you deal with all of those pressures that you're describing that you were dealing with?
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about your perception of both of them can exist at the same time. And that was my experience. I had extreme pain and extreme joy happening simultaneously. And that's because of Alexis. and being able to key in on, she's still learning how to sit and how to crawl, and you saying mama, all of the firsts that are coming with that. And so I really leaned into, I am going to listen to the giggles, and I am going to engage on the floor, and I'm going to just be the mom, because that's really the only part of my identity that that wasn't shaken to the core. Was being her mom. Everything else, being a spouse, being a mother, or sorry, being a spouse, being a teacher. I didn't go back. I was on maternity leave. I didn't have the patience to go back into the classroom right away. I didn't have the capacity to do all of those things. So I really leaned into being a mom and still allowing myself to show emotion. I had the cries. I had the, I don't want to eat right now. I had some sleepless nights, and then other days that I was sleeping longer, not as many just because of the responsibilities of being a mom. But that's kind of how I did it. And I gave myself a lot of grace. And I say that I came to understand very quickly that the grief journey for me versus Chris's parents, for his siblings, for my parents, that was all going to look different. And we as a family acknowledged that and didn't put pressure on each other to act a certain way or to move on you move through and you figure it out. But we were very supportive that our journeys were going to look different, because mine moved at a pace that wasn't in line with Chris's parents and that same pace. And so that created conflict for a little while. When I moved to Ottawa, when I started to date again, I'm now 30. It looks different when you're 30 than when you're in your 60s. So it's allowing myself the space to be okay with where I was at and how I was feeling while I was doing it, and being honest with everyone that I felt that I was doing what served me best. And I say I wasn't always as polished as I am now in the way that I articulated myself. I was very blunt. If it did not directly serve me and Alexis, then I told you. And it was very direct, and people knew, okay, like, give her some space, or whatever the thing was. But I learned early on as well not to mask how I was feeling or what I wanted. I spoke very authentically very early on. And I find even with the clients that I teach through my grief coaching, they're scared to do that. They're scared to really express how they're feeling because they think it contradicts the expectations that others have of them.
Wow.
Yeah. Is that quality of being able to sort of be authentic and speak for what it was and not mask? Do you think that was something that you possessed before Chris's death, or do you think that's something that was forged in the aftermath?
Yeah, I believe it was more forged in the aftermath. I remember about 3 weeks after the shooting, there was a memorial in Hay River, and my parents had flown up for it. And I made a speech, and my sister had Alexis up there with me. And my dad said to me after, he's like, "You are not the same girl that left my house when you were 19." So that, so it's I was a little bit more reserved. I'm one of 4 girls in my family. I'm the third of 4, and there was a lot of competition for airtime, and I didn't exercise a whole lot of it. I let the other folks, listen. When I had something to say, I said it, but I had a lot more to say after Chris died than I think I did earlier on.
Yeah, I can't, I'm just, what's going on inside of me right now is I'm just imagining this process for you, where at least for a period of time, there was, I think you engaged with it almost like you were giving a gift back, but there was like an expectation that this happen out loud and that this be in public and having to give speeches. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I'm just kind of reflecting on what that might have been like for you to have this incredibly personal thing that you're going through with you and your daughter, and trying to find the ground underneath you while there's this be out there and share a message. And
I think what helped me there, one, just being an educator, and still now, I'm wanting to make online courses to support families and doing all of the things. So I had that then. And then the policing community is quite small. And Hay River's only 3,500 people, and we were there long enough that we knew a large portion of the folks. And so it was like I just felt wrapped by family. And I also realized even then, you know, as I'm trying to write these speeches, when you can put words to things, you begin to process them. And so, I mean, I gave I was in Hay River for 5 days after the shooting before I flew to Ottawa, and I gave a speech on my front lawn, like to the news. And they said, you know, do you want the RCMP to do it? I'm like, no, I want to speak. I want, you know, because at that time the shooter hadn't been apprehended, and I wanted the members on the ground to know, like, this is who you're fighting for right now. Like, do your best work, because this is the face of the family of the fallen. And so, yeah, very early on, just wanting to, I wanted to control the narrative, and that was about the only thing that I felt like I had any control over.
Mm.
Yeah. I'm able to know that now. I didn't then.
Yeah. Which strikes me as being, you know, it's one of the things oftentimes that we do talk about with people in the immediate aftermath, or even as they're trying to work through something at some, you know, temporal point down the line, is like, what can you actually have some influence over in this process, you know? And even at the end of the day, if all we're left with is the choice around the words we use or the attitude we try to possess, that's kind of still something, right? That seems to be so. I just get really curious about that when you look over the course of, you know, human civilization, and you see that idea repeated, you know, over and over and over again, that at the end of it all, what we have is we get to choose how we show up to these things.
Mm-hmm.
What struck me in that is the "and" statements. You know, and I want first responders and families and people that listen to understand that you can hold both of those things. You can be in pain and find joy. You can have grief, sorrow, loss, and see awe. And I think, you know, until I understood that personally, it was a really hard path, because it was all or nothing. It's black or white thinking. And I think, you know, from a first responder lens, we're trained that way. And there is something so much more powerful when you can hold the "and" in space. I can be frustrated and joyful, or whatever it is. It's just the emotional landscape, but understanding that both things can be held in equal components or equal weight. You know, and that's something that I think is so important, that I had to learn, that I just didn't understand to a depth that I do now. Mm-hmm. And people need to just put it into practice somehow. I don't know how that happens. I mean, I talk about it with people in my sphere, and they call me out on it and say, you can't. And I say, you can. And then it's this tension that we have in the conversation, but, you know, we agree to disagree eventually, and hopefully they find that space too.
Yeah. There's a quote from Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, in Man's Search for Meaning. And it's one of the ones that I didn't have at the time. I had it a few years later, but I love it. And it's like, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so it's just like, how can we lengthen that space so that we're choosing better?
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so then we become less reactive, or if we are reactive, then, you know, you have a better response because of the conscious effort that you're putting into what it is that you want to do next.
I love that.
Yeah, totally. And I think, you know, and I feel like we're hearing this from you, Jodie, even just in how you did try to lean into what was happening around Chris's death and in the months afterwards. Like, I think part of then, if you can find a way to have that space, you know, it's also about knowing what you stand for, you know, and how do I want to sort of show up to what is important for me and my daughter and my family, and how do I want to represent this? And, you know, if I'm looking back on this a year from now, you know what I mean? Like, I think those are the things that we also need to be clear about, is life is going to come for us in all sorts of different ways. And that we can guarantee. You know, we can't guarantee how any of us is necessarily going to show up for it, but I think we can try to help ourselves by, you know, routinely reminding ourselves, like, in this time that I'm given, you know, what do I want to be remembered for? How do I want to be seen to deal with these things when they occur.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I was aware too, because of the coverage of the story, that Alexis was going to grow up and then want to know what happened and what did that look like.
Yeah.
And there again, I had that conscious awareness of this is going to be out there. I have a choice to be part of that or not. How do I want her to see her mom?
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
Has she seen it? Like, has she? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think part of the story I didn't get into with the introduction because I thought it was going to be too long. When my mom came from Ontario to help after the large surgery in January of 2023, she brought with her 3 large creative memory scrapbooks, like everything made by hand that had newspaper clippings and cards and photos all surrounding the time of Chris's murder. And so she came and Alexis was reading these 3 books and was coming to me while I was in the bedroom. And she was a little upset. She's like, Mom, what you told me isn't what I'm reading. And that's because as she asked me questions as she was growing up, I gave her the answers that came out as evidence at the trial, as opposed to what was being reported in the media before they had all of the answers. And so it was that experience that caused me to start to do the journaling, because I was thinking and having to revisit that time in my life and answer questions from a 16-year-old as opposed to, a 6, 8, 10-year-old.
Right.
So yeah, she's very aware of what's happened. And it's a continuous process now that I've had to ask her if she wants to be engaged in. So the shooter was convicted of first-degree murder, was sentenced to life in prison for 25 years before eligibility of parole. However, there is a clause that was in the criminal code. It has since been repealed. In 2011, they removed it. However, because his crime was committed in 2007, he's able to exercise it. It's called the faint hope clause. And that means that after 15 years of being sentenced or served his sentence, he's able to apply through this clause for an opportunity to go in front of the parole board early. And there's a process for that, which requires written submissions. If the judge says, yes, it has merit, then it goes to a jury. They have to unanimously agree. And then he has the opportunity to apply to go in front of the parole board and then has to make his case there. So it's a long process. However, that started the same week I got home from the hospital. So all of the things were happening at the same time. And you talk about those moments, you're just like, I'm done. I don't know what you want right now. That was one of them. Because I wrote Alexis's victim impact statement in her voice when she was 2. I read mine and then I read hers. I wrote hers. And so we had the opportunity to write new ones. And so she's 16, engaging her in that conversation about, do you want to be a part of this process? Do you want to put your words to this? You've read everything that grandma brought in the books. Now, do you want to write something moving forward in order to have your voice heard in that way? She ultimately chose not to, but gave me permission to write on her behalf again in my updated statement. But there again, you go through life, and when you need more concentrated support, funny, not funny. So, my body had changed. I was having issues with how I was looking, and I emailed one of the psychologists from Brent's practice. And the intake forms, like, why do you want to come? And I was just like, I'm having body image issues after cancer surgery. By the time I got into her into her office, I'm like, well, this is happening in the legal system, so let's just shift focus. There again, the body image issues just went away, and we focus on this, and it puts things back into perspective about things in that way. It turns out that psychology was actually a second career for my therapist. She had spent 30 years with the Parole Board of Canada. Ironically enough, I didn't know that about her. It didn't say that on her profile. So she was able to help me navigate that process, probably more gracefully than anyone else that I would have been able to find. So it's, yeah.
The universe had a plan with that one, I think.
That one they did. Yeah.
So, Ryan, I'm asking a million questions because I'm into this, but is that okay?
No, the funny thing is half the stuff that's coming out that you're asking is stuff that's percolating in my head already.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. Jodie, one of the, and I don't know that I even totally have a question. It's just like a theme that I'm hoping we can explore, because the issue of identity just feels really big, like for you and for Alexis and maybe your whole family, right? Because there would be identity assignations that could happen for both of you that I don't know if you'd want or she would want. Like, can you just speak to that? Like how identity has been for you maybe since Chris's murder and beyond?
Oh, the word widow still don't love. Still like choke on it a little bit, right? And so it's that I really didn't love. I'm okay with it now. And so when I went into the RCMP, I was very aware that people knew who I was and I didn't know who they were. And I didn't want to be perceived as a pity hire. I wanted to be like, I am here because I have the education and the skills and the knowledge in order to do this job. So I felt like I was trying to prove myself for the first part of my time, until I felt a little bit more comfortable in the role. And then it was, I wanted not to be like Jodie Warden. I just wanted to be Jodie. And then when I fall in love and then marry Brent and I take his last name, now I'm Jodie Baulkham, and what does that look like? And when I did my life coach certification course a couple of years ago, that's when I really started to examine my identity a little bit more than I ever had before, because I would attach titles to I am a mom, I'm a sister, I am a mental health champion, I am a curriculum designer, and so I'm just like, is that who I am, or that's what I do? And so it was that kind of push-pull. Now I am much more able to say, I like to have puppy cuddles. I like to, I talk about more about what I enjoy that makes me happy, as opposed to what I do. And the who I am is still a question that is got a long answer, but at the heart of it, I drop all of the roles and just focus on the feelings when it comes to who am I and what do I enjoy. And Alexis too, she enjoys getting new teachers. This is terrible. She enjoys getting new teachers in a way that she can share her story about her upbringing in a way that she can educate them. And she's like, and often I get a really good mark. Now, Alexis is a good student, but it's like, she's able to articulate her story in a way that hits the teachers wow, like I've got this young person that's gone through all of this stuff. And so she's also used writing as a way to process different things in her life. And Brent's two sons from a previous marriage, her brothers, they've both gone on to get psychology degrees. One practices as a clinical counselor in Victoria in nature-based therapy, and the other is a vice principal and has worked as a school counselor at a junior high. And so it's the whole family has conversations about wellness and mental health in a way that I love, and it's just so open, and it really helps to perpetuate that when you talk about things, there's a shift. Because listening to my stepsons talk about their teenage years when Brent was living with his injuries but not getting treated for it looks a whole lot different than Alexis's growth and support as she was raised here. So I'm not sure, I've kind of gone in circles about the identity, but it's for me, letting go of the terms and the roles and just really focusing in on the things that make me light up in a way.
No, I think you answered. I mean, yeah, I loved your answer, because I think those are some of the things that I contemplate. I think, Ryan, you do too. Like, Ryan and I are both, Ryan, I'm speaking a lot for you. So like, I don't mean to, you can tell me to shut up, but we talk a lot and think a lot about, Stoic philosophy and what that has to teach us and so on and so forth. And, one of the things that is recommended from that philosophy, and we see it in therapeutic approaches, as I'm sure you know, right, is like, okay, let's just actually actively visualize the negative thing. Like, what could it look like, right?
Yeah.
And I do that sometimes, and I go, okay, like, what if all of a sudden psychology was no longer an option for me? What if this happened? What if that happened? It's like, what do I think would occur, and like I think it would be exceptionally difficult, but I have this kind of knowledge, I think, that I would just go in a different direction or what have you. And I think there's such value in holding the identity labels or whatever really gently, because they can change, right? And I know that I see this a lot in the work that I do. Like, there's a lot of grieving that people have to go through when all of a sudden there's an identity loss, whether that's with career, whether that's all of a sudden having a diagnosis. Like, there's a lot that can come for us if we maybe aren't alive to, there's the things that define us, and then there's the things that are about us.
I love that.
Yeah, and I had to learn that identity piece. I mean, it's driven into us, I think, as first responders, that you are a police officer, you are a paramedic, you are a insert whatever role or title that is. And I talked to a lot of students when I was mentoring students on the ambulance from time to time about careful how much you attach your role, right, as an advanced care paramedic or a primary care paramedic to who you are. And I think, all of us get lost in that piece a little bit. But I think it takes a lot of, not effort, but a lot of really self-reflection to see all of the other layers. It took a while for me to get there as well, but I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a brother. I'm all of these other things. And what I'm blessed to be able to do when I was on the street was work on it as a first responder. And now sitting here, I mean, who would have thought 2 years ago a podcast would be something that we're doing? So I think that non-attachment to that identity is so important because, like you said, Megan, things change. Things have a way of just changing when you're least expecting them.
And hopefully they're not going to be catastrophic changes, right? Like, I mean, hopefully there's things that we can plan for or think about, but that's not on our terms necessarily, right? And I really like that, Jodie, like that idea of like, let's focus on how things make us feel or how they line up with our values or, like how they affect our relationships or something like that, versus, the descriptors or the definitions that go along with them, because those can and will inevitably change.
Yeah. And I saw that the difficulties that Brent had, you talk, Ryan, about that, like the over-identification of the role that you have. And, Brent, he was Staff Sergeant Baulkham. He was a member of the RCMP. When he was no longer able to fulfill that role, it was crushing.
Yeah.
It was crushing for him. And when I speak in classes, I quote Dr. Kevin Gilmartin's work, right? When he talks about the USTAs. Well, I used to go camping and I used to go fishing and I used to all of these things. Well, those are red flags that you're really stepping outside of the things that bring you joy and over stepping into everything else. And so acknowledging that and using that as a way to check yourself a little bit about where you are and how you're showing up right now in the world.
I love the fact that you referenced Dr. Gilmartin's work. It's for our listeners or viewers, it's Dr. Kevin Gilmartin. It's Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. It's one of, for me, just replace the word law enforcement or police officer with paramedic. I think it's one of those books that, for me, when I read it, was one of those aha moments of the USTAs, the chair. Thankfully, I've passed that portion of my life and gotten to the other side and I'm quite healthy. But yeah, there's a lot of those aha moments when I read that as a first responder that you just, you used to do this and there's a lot of things I used to do that didn't do anymore for a variety of different reasons, right? I'm busy or too tired or whatever that case may be. But yeah, that identity loss seems to be huge for most of us that sit with the uniform culture is, when you lose that title for whatever reason, whether you're, you can't go back to work, you're medically discharged, or, a variety of different reasons. I mean, it's hard. There is an identity loss that has to be, and a grieving process, really, when it comes down to it.
Mm-hmm. So I have like two more themes, Jodie, that I want to ask you about before we run out of time. So one of them is like you just have this wealth of knowledge and experience, I think, about like what it means to be in a first responder family. And I'm not even sure if that's a term we want to use. But like sitting here today with us at this moment in time, what have you learned, or what do you think we don't get right, or what do you think we need to know about how to take care of first responder families?
Oh, wow. I love that you've asked that. That's actually what part 3 of my book is. I offer 11 lessons, and I don't need to go through all 11, but the themes really are about how are you able to allow yourself to personally grow and build your resilience while you're in the family dynamic of a first responder. Effective communication and emotional intelligence are critical, because the first thing that's going to go, they're going to start to withdraw. So how do you engage? How do you ask questions where you are not sounding like you're being judgmental? That is going to facilitate open conversations, because we know that a lot of our uniform members aren't comfortable talking about how they're feeling with respect to mental health. The stigma is pervasive. And then, mental health supports and awareness. So knowing when you're starting to shift and change. But for me, when I learned not to take things personally, that Brent's response to the world wasn't directly linked to my value or my worth, that's when life changed for me. I was really focusing in on trying to orchestrate the outside world around me. All of my effort was getting put into creating an environment where I thought Brent and Alexis would feel safe. So everything was clean and it was orderly. And I thought my superpower of being a great project manager was helpful, but really that was just me that was a maladaptive coping strategy. And after Alexis's diagnosis, I went to my own therapist, and June introduced me to the work of Brené Brown. And my homework along with other modalities, was to read Brené's book, Rising Strong. And so I started to really understand the strength and vulnerability, and how to shift that narrative of the stories that you're telling yourself. And I started to let go of the things that I couldn't control, and being able to identify at first, what are those things? Like I wanted to just had my hand in everything, and just taking a step back and realizing that both Brent and Alexis were on their own journey. I could help facilitate support, but I couldn't do it for them. That's when I started to really start to be able to do the work for me. And as my confidence grew in how I was able to show up in my home, I had the confidence in order to start engaging communication in a more effective way. How do you ask questions that support communication? Alexis was introduced to the feelings wheel, as part of her therapy. That became a conversation at our dinner table. And so it was the tools that Alexis was given through her therapist that actually helped Brent and I as a couple very, very well, because it forced us to have those conversations. And the language that the child therapist used, probably Brent was able to relate to it more, because at the time, he didn't have a lot of capacity, wasn't a lot of memory, wasn't able to take in a lot of information. So the juvenile language of the child psychologist and the tools that Alexis was using really helped support him when he was his most ill. And so using that helpful language, gosh, if he was angry, I would be angry. I'd try to fight it. Right? If he was silent, then I would meet his silence, right? Not effective. And so when I started to work on myself, then I was able to learn those, active listening, engaging conversations, open-ended questions, all of those things. And then just the empathy that I was able to have as a result of where I had been with Chris. And I was able to bring that into our relationship at home. And that was also really helpful. And learning that you can just provide that safe space and just sit there. And I'll share, like, there were months where Brent had suicidal ideation. And so I found both of us, he'd go downstairs in the TV room and watch depressive, violent movies. And I just sit beside him. You are not alone. I hated those movies. If I need to watch, Sniper or The Bourne, whatever the case may be, that's where he would go. And so just to know that I was there was really helpful, so that when he was able to engage, you know, in that way, I was ready, and so was he. And so, just slowly, bit by bit, first responder families. Often, it's the non-first responder spouse, I would say, is a little bit more well adjusted in order to have the capacity to change their behavior more than the first responder if they're struggling. And so, giving yourself grace in order to, some days you're going to get it right and some days you're not, and that's okay. And just continue to re-engage and continue to try, because the capacity of your spouse could change from day to day. We implemented the number system in our house. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10, I've got the most capacity to talk to you about the hard things and make decisions right now, and 1 being I don't have any at all. We would rate ourselves. And so if either one of us was at a 3 or below, there was no point trying to have a deeper conversation, because the capacity to take information in and to respond in a way that was going to meet my expectation wasn't present. So it was like kind of waiting for the times and giving grace in order to let him know that when he was ready, I was going to be there. And so, what do we get right? I think there's a lot of support within the families of first responders when it talks about, finding other community members and other first responder families, because there is a level of, we know what you're going through. We know that it's hard. Shift work is hard. Oftentimes I've been speaking with a lot of firefighter spouses, and they're just like, I'm like an only parent for 5 days. And then there's an adjustment period when my spouse comes back home, because now he's there and that switches the routine. And how do we manage that? And so I think if first responder families can step into communication that's effective more often than not, then it'll set them up for a great foundation and some success moving forward.
In that last little bit there, I just saw me in everything you described. Right. And that relationship and communication is something that both my partner and I had to figure out. And I think you just so eloquently articulated what we need to do as first responder families and spouses and partners of first responders, because that avoidance, that just not, it's that parasympathetic dump from Dr. Gilmartin's work, coming home and sitting in the chair and not wanting to engage, indifference. We talk about it as the hypoarousal from the window of tolerance in our programs. I mean, I think that's the understanding we need to get to, is that that's a normal process, but we have choices and we can actually create the space. And first responder partners really need to be aware that if I just had my spouse, Tracy, sitting beside me at those moments, some of those moments where it was difficult, instead of both of us kind of not communicating and not figuring it out, and thankfully we're still together and everything's great, but it can be done on the front end. We can change the conversations on the front end, which may create longer term supports and a feeling of connectedness, right? Which is so important, because I'm going to go to my spouse first, right? As a first responder, I always will. But I don't know how to communicate that. I just know that I'm irritable and angry, right? So thank you for articulating that, because I saw myself in a lot of what you're saying.
And I think we think that, if we're trying to train first responders differently in terms of how to take care of themselves in the job, we should be including family members in those conversations. Like, it sounds like you, again, had some instincts and some wisdom around, okay, this is what I think could be helpful here. Some people might not have that sense, right?
100%.
And that whole thing about not taking it personally, I was just like, wow, that's really cool that that, right? And hard to do in the moment when something feels personal, right?
Yeah. No, it's
So,
go ahead. I was just going to say, your point about bringing in the families is so critical, because as I talk and I deliver these spousal presentations, there's so many light bulbs that go on, and they're just like, I wish I had known this 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Totally, right? We hear that all the time. So hence some of our interests, for sure. So I guess my final question or theme is like, and I don't even know if I always love this question. I just find myself curious. Like, it's a little bit of like, what do you wish you knew then? What are you glad you found out as the journey unfolded?
Oof. I'm not sure I would want to know anything at the outset. As the journey was unfolding, what do I wish I had have known? I think knowing the signs and symptoms earlier in Brent would have shifted, I think, the trajectory. So like I didn't get into the mental health ally world and the facilitation until after he was quite ill. Once I had already kind of had the home education in order to match it with the academic education and to facilitate. And so when he was telling me that he was tired because he was traveling a lot, or when he started to exhibit those symptoms early on, and I believed the excuses that he gave me, I wish I had more knowledge at that point in order to intervene earlier. Because we talk about the mental health continuum and the different colors, like Brent was so far in the red. It's and it's 14 years on, and he's still engaged regularly in support in his recovery. But it took him so much more time, effort, and pain in order to move all of that way, where if I could have had supported earlier on, it may not have been as arduous. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll buy that for $1. I think that, I don't think we can eradicate this issue completely, but yeah, I mean, maybe there's a factor of suffering that we can influence, and then all the sequelae that would come from being able to intervene earlier or differently or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a really cool equation that I learned in my mindfulness practice, and it's pain times resistance equals suffering. So really, I think it's Eugene Cash or somebody else, I can't remember who said it, but pain is inevitable, but degrees of suffering are optional. When we decrease the resistance to the events or to what is through whatever that process might be, we decrease our suffering. And I think that can be incremental, but it can also be long lasting. And we have the ability through really cultivated tools and understanding to shift that idea, because pain is going to occur every single day in some way, shape, or form. But how we resist against that potentially has the ability to increase our suffering and whatever that experience is. And I do agree, it all needs to come on the front end. I mean, I look back at my career, and 25 years ago, it was a 1-page, 11-minute lecture. And it was good luck, basically. And you talked about the continuum, and I would surmise that I was probably between the yellow and orange and often in the red from day to day, moment to moment, with no real understanding of what that is and what tools I can use to kind of swing that pendulum back a little bit before I went home. So I think that's why I'm so passionate about these conversations, because, the themes are consistent. When people talk about this, it's the same idea of let's put it on the front end. Let's give people the language. Let's talk about emotions. Let's dispel some of the myths. Let's create different identities so that we can better understand who we are that sits underneath our uniforms. And it's kind of starting to see this theme with everybody we've talked to, not only just on podcasts, but in conferences or with conversations wherever we go. It's the same theme. So we do need to do something that supports families, the first responders, across the span of their careers, from recruitment to retirement, because we owe it to them.
So Jodie, my final question to you is, if you had to speculate or wonder, what do you think Chris would think about what you've done since he was killed?
Oh, I think he'd say we did one hell of a job raising Alexis. I seek a lot of encouragement and value in thinking that she's a great kid, and oh my gosh, does she have so many of his best qualities, and looks just like him, and just continuing the relationship that we have with his family. I think he would be very proud and supportive of that, and then seeing how I've grown up. I mean, I think he would be very happy with the 21-year-old that he started to date versus the 46-year-old woman that is sitting in front of you today, and what I've accomplished and the impact that I want to make for people, and the place of just like the pure intention of why you want to do it. I think those were things that he lived by, you know. So thank you for asking. I really appreciate that.
So I'll give you a shameless plug, Jodie. Go ahead, tell us where we can find your book. Because I think from a first responder lens, if you are a first responder or a partner of a first responder, I think just given this very short and brief conversation, I've read the first probably chapter and a half of the PDF that you sent me. It's amazing. Get into it, folks. So go for it, Jodie.
Thanks. My book is available on Amazon. You can find me at www.jodiebaulkham.com. Reach out anytime. I'm speaking at different teacher conferences, which I'm really excited about. Just getting in front of first responder families is really the goal. Hopefully by the time this airs, I'll have a couple of online courses that support families for people to consume, and just, you know, anything that you want to see from an educational perspective around this, happy to have those conversations.
Amazing.
This was awesome, Jodie. Thank you. I mean, I feel like, you know, there's twists of fate that, you know, landed us sitting beside one another back in the spring. And I'm so happy to have met you and to know that you're out there doing this incredible work that you're doing. So thank you for your gift of your time today and what you shared with us. I continue to be really compelled and inspired by what you have to offer.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated being here.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Mental Health Mixtape, brought to you by the Before Operational Stress Program. We hope today's conversation has resonated with you and provided valuable insights into navigating the complexities of mental health. Remember, your well-being is our priority. If you or someone you know could benefit from the support and resources offered by the Before Operational Stress Program, don't hesitate to reach out. Take that first step towards a healthier, more resilient you. And here's a special treat for our dedicated listeners. A 15% discount waits for you when you sign up through the code provided in the show notes. Investing in your mental health has never been more accessible. We appreciate your continued support and commitment to breaking the stigma surrounding mental health. Let's keep the conversation going. And until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.